I was thinking if I were a student, I wouldn't be taking this class because it's too much reading and too many hours of seminar and for one credit. So I'm very impressed that you guys are hanging on there. How many of you come here for the first time? Anybody? Or everybody have been in the past? There's one? Oh, okay. Come on in. So I hope, because this will be a smaller class, some people obviously are too busy to continue, which is fine. I think this is the first time that they offer this kind of intensive workshop. My suggestion would be to really reduce the workload and to make it easier for people with other competing commitments. But I'm going to use the first part of today's seminar to stick with our original agenda, which is to look at my second book, which offers a second mode of comparison. And I would be using the same strategy. I will be going through the whole process, telling you, what decisions or considerations I made as I try to finish or tackle this project, so that you get a sense of what happened. Now, without me telling you what happened, if you just read the book, which I assigned the first part, chapter 1, the preface to chapter 1, and then chapter 3, no? Or just chapter 3? Okay. So, I don't know, how many of you pick up a book and think that you read from the beginning, and that is how, as researcher, we also started. That is, we started with the introduction. Have you ever thought about when actually the order of reading is different from the order of writing, and is different from the order of researching?
I took a class.
Speak.
I took a class before, and once the professor suggested that we can do begin from the second chapter and go back to guess what the author write about the first.
The recommendation was to read from the second chapter.
He says we can try
Reading from the second chapter.
and to go back guess what kind of framework, what kind of question that the author asked and brought up.
Yes. Well, I'm going to tell you that when you read the book, the order in which you are reading is totally different from the order in which the book was written, and it's totally different from the order in which the research was being carried out. So, first thing you read usually is the introduction. And it usually gives you the things that actually came last in the research process. This is very important because if you didn't realize that the introduction actually came last, you would be very anxious because you think that everybody began with a clear picture of what they want to study, what the research questions are, what literature will be relevant. The literature review are so tidy and neat and targeted. You will be asking yourself, am I doing the right thing? Because I don't have that kind of neat and tidy, focused literature review. So I want to start by saying that, no, everybody start in a very messy way, and what you see in the introduction, and introduction is always written or finalized last. That's the last part, and the very, very last thing usually is the title. But this is usually what you read first, what catches your eye, but it is all in reverse. So to open up this black box of research is, I hope, will be reassuring to you, because you will have a real sense of how things are made, how books are written, how research is actually undertaken, and not to mistake the form of the book for the process of research. You look at the table of content, all these are very well structured, but the research process is the exact opposite of what you see especially for ethnographic research. And so it is only at the end that usually you readjust your introduction chapter, which means you readjust your literature review. It also is in the last part that you have your clear argument that you would let your readers know at the very beginning or somewhere in the introduction. So a very clear statement of what the book is about, what the arguments are, come in the introduction, but they do not emerge until the very end of the project. So that's why, as a reader, you may not understand or realize what the real process of research is. And that's why I think there's a point to do seminars like this for the authors to sort of break open the black box so that you would know what to expect when it comes to time for you to execute the research and also to write. And a very important, I think very useful piece of advice is after you do your field work and then you have some arguments emerging in your head, when you start writing, I never advise my own students to write the introduction first. Introduction you write last. You start with the substantive chapters. So if there are 3, 4 empirical chapters, start with those. You know your empirical story, you design them into chapters 2, 3, and 4. Start with the middle of the book. You don't start by writing the introduction. You can, but the author, you will come back and revise it extensively. So why waste your time? But the empirical materials are pretty much there, the same, no matter how you twist your introduction or revise it. So I would suggest that, and then by writing the empirical chapters, you are more acquainted with your own data. You know exactly what is lacking, and by writing those chapters, oftentimes it's also true that writing them out, seeing them in paper, objectify your finding will help you see the arguments much better. So therefore, there are many reasons for people to write the substantive chapter. That means you write the middle of the book first. And then try to write a draft of the introduction. And then you go back to the empirical chapter, revise it, and see what exactly should the introduction be. Because even though I said last time about, that you have to think about the puzzle vis-a-vis literature, the exact literature review, what should go in, you have to reconstitute in light of your empirical finding. So the introduction, especially how you constitute the literature review. Literature review has to be constituted. They don't exist ready-made because your topic is this, therefore you have some ready-made literature review. No, you have to constitute the literature review in light of your own findings and what is particularly interesting about the findings, because you want to frame your literature review in such a way that you can highlight your own contribution vis-a-vis the literature. So that's why you need to know very well what your finding is and what the theoretical significance is, and then adjust your theoretical framework accordingly. So that's why I've written 3 books so far, and every time the above process, which is starting with the middle of the book, think about the introduction but not writing the introduction, look at the empirical data, and then I'll write the introduction last, or revise my introduction last. So the last thing to finish will be the introduction, and of course the conclusion, but that's quite obvious. And then, that's why I think the point today is to really reveal the black box of doing this book. How I will start with the components that I introduced to you on the first day of the class, the various components that you have to decide, finding the question, the theoretical puzzle, how to how to constitute cases, and of course thinking about access to the field, sampling, so on and so forth. And I will tell you the messiness of it all, even though, and it may be because it is such a messy process, all the more reason, all the more important for you to know the critical components that go into that things that you should be thinking about as you do the research, because it will be so messy that you may get lost very easily. But if you know that whatever happens in the field, you have to address these issues: casing, theoretical sampling, concept formation, theory reconstruction. So those are the things that you have heard of already in the first day. And okay, so this is the book that came out in 2007. You can tell the first book was published in 1998, so it's 9 years after the first book, and it usually is, well, for me at least, it takes that long. And then between the second book and the third book is how many years? 10 years, so even longer. So the first book is 9, and then it's 10. There's no merit to having such a long period in between books. It just means that your project, my project, requires that much time. The time is no indication of quality. Doesn't mean the longer you spend between books means better quality. But sometimes it's because the topic is more complicated, and you will see this second book is much more complicated, at least, and more difficult for me to do and write than the first one. Now the first one, if you remember, about 2 factories in South China. The easiest part about that research was the fact that I have a very clear idea of what the sites are. Factories. And they are empirical entities. You go in a factory, you know when you exit the factories. So somebody mentioned the idea of institutional ethnography. It is one kind of institutional ethnography because I was looking at the internal working, the logic, internal relationship inside the factories and how it relates to the broader political economy. But in that project has a certain degree of it's not challenging because it's very clear what my cases are. Now in this particular project, protest project, casing is not as obvious and simple as the first book, because I was interested in labor protest rather than factories, which are bounded entities and bounded institutions. Protests are challenging because you don't know when they happen, usually, and it's politically sensitive. These things take place, in my case, in an authoritarian country, which police usually don't want protests to happen, and once they happen, they don't want people to know or to study. And it's very difficult to get inside as a participant of protests because I was not a worker. I couldn't sign up to the boss and say, hey, I want to be a protest participant. That role doesn't exist, right? So in many ways, and also protests happen anywhere. Not strike. Strike happens in factories, so there's still a very concrete location for PO, for participant observation. But protest, it could erupt geographically. They are more dispersed. So this is the first set of challenge. And of course, how to conceptualize the project it has taken me longer time. And I've been going back and forth. But this is natural too. I didn't have this idea of 2 cases until maybe in the middle of the process, that I could clearly see what I could make out of these 2 provinces and to see and to constitute them as 2 theoretical cases. I will explain that in a minute, but it's just more challenging. And why did I arrive at this project? What inspired me to move from a factory regime project to labor protest project? So the context of discovery. How did I discover this project? Well, at that time, when I finished my first book it was published in 1998, so I started thinking of a new project in 1997, around that time. And China, now the first book was about China's rise as a workshop of the world. In a particular corner of China, they were still experimenting with opening up special economic zone. But the larger part of China at that time, at the time when I was writing my first book, was pretty much going through some very slow changes, uncertain changes. But by the time I finished the book, at the end, towards the end of the 1990s, social scientists began to talk a lot about transition. It was quite clear that China was making the transition from state socialism to integration with the global capitalist economy. There was a sense that there was no going back. It has gone beyond the stage of experiment, of special economic zone. Particularly, there was very vibrant reform, radical reforms of the state-owned industrial sector, which has led to tremendous, deep industrial restructuring. I mean, imagine the whole economy before the reform was totally based on state-owned or collectively owned industries or sector. By this time, late 1990s, the industrial restructuring we were witnessing was to get rid of a big chunk of the state-owned sector in terms of corporate ownership, but most importantly and most politically significant was the production of a large number of unemployed workers. If you look back to the surveys and opinion polls published by the government, not social scientists, but government, they were so worried about unemployment because in every poll that they took during that period, unemployment, what they call 下岗, was the number one social political issue that people would mention. And so every day the news was really, it was not about nationalism. There was not about many other environmental issues. No, it was about labor, particularly unemployment, and that resulted from industrial restructuring. And workers' protests became almost daily news. It was, the media couldn't even hide the large number of labor protests because they happened so often. And they were so concentrated, mostly in what I eventually call the Rust Belt region. But in those days, Rust Belt was not being talked about. It was in the Northeast, in places where you have large numbers of state-owned industries that were asked to go bankrupt. Again, unheard of. And I think people who are used to the capitalist kind of system wouldn't be in a position to really appreciate the kind of existential challenge that was created by such massive industrial restructuring and massive unemployment. So protest was a national, political, and social issue. Social because these were basically middle-aged people or people near retirement, and the numbers were staggering. You can look up maybe it was in the readings. I think within just a matter of several years, 60 million people experienced unemployment. Now, eventually, some of them will find some jobs. They will be re-employed. But in a matter of years, you have how many people in Taiwan? 20-some million? Imagine 3 times Taiwan's population became unemployed in a matter of years. And these people came of age under Mao, which the government promised them, work for us, very low wages, don't worry about pension, retirement will cover your pension until you die, medical expenses included, housing included, your kids will replace you. There's a policy for the children to ding their positions. So, but then all were gone. None of this happened. And the state just unilaterally say, hey, the bargain is over, we're not offering you these anymore. So it was a big shock. The shock that took very tragic human form that I described in the book, and I will talk a little bit later. But it was a big issue. So for me, somebody who have been studying labor in the South, there is no other more natural project for me. Empirically, this project involves a bigger vision of China, but if you look at the underlying theoretical interest, I haven't really deviated from that too much. It's just the empirical world that has changed, and therefore the same theoretical question now takes another form. So the theoretical question that really motivated my first book was about workers' role in China's becoming the workshop of the world, but I was looking at how they were controlled, because to become the workshop of the world, you need very, constant supply of cheap, docile labor. So the question was, how was it possible? Now, as China was experiencing another stage of transition, integration with capitalism, the question is, how was the transition made possible or hindered by labor? So it's still about the role of the working class in China's political or more economic development. But now, because of protest, the question is slightly different. It's about resistance. But the underlying concern is the same, to try to understand China's development through the experience of workers. Imagine if working class movement was so strong to resist transition. There would be no transition, or transition would be stalled or obstructed. They would have to stop the reform if working class protest would be powerful enough. But if working class protests happened but didn't amount to a big challenge, then China would be making a more or less smooth transition to a more capitalist kind of political economy. So either way, labor is at the center of this process. So in a way, I was still the person that I was, the person who was thinking about labor and development of China as I was in the first book. Okay, so then, and something happened also while I was thinking about finding a new project for my book. I was working on in Guangzhou after I finished my book. I was trying to understand sale enterprise SOE reform in Guangzhou. So I went there, and eventually I published several pieces out of that research. I was trying to ask the workers there who were not laid off yet, who have to struggle with participating in the market while remaining in the planned economy. So they moonlight. Moonlight is a big topic in those years because workers, they remain full-time workers, but many of them try to find additional earning in the market. So it was a very interesting system. You have usually in the working class family, one family, two systems. In the sense that they would participate. Somebody in the family would be responsible for taking advantage of the market, earn extra. Another person, usually the woman, will stay in the state-owned sector to sort of acquire the security. So opportunity and security. So there's a gender division of labor within the family, and I think I wrote about one family, two systems, reflecting, or echoing the one country, two systems kind of formulation. But what really led me, because I didn't have any contact, I was in the South. I've never been to the Rust Belt, at that time. So this is interesting. But I ran into, again, you can say, oh, you're always so lucky. You always have people helping you to develop your next project. But I think luck will only come and will only be useful if you have already been thinking about doing something. Otherwise, this person that eventually connect me to the Rust Belt, he will be there, but I wouldn't be thinking about, developing a project through him. What happened was, there is this party historian. He's a Communist Party historian. I met in Guangzhou, then you would ask, why would a Communist Party historian from the Northeast in Liaoning, why would he come to Guangzhou? He is the one in the family that want to take advantage of the market. He didn't quit his job as a party historian in a town in Liaoning. He actually left to post what they call long vacation. And in those days, you can take long vacations and then keep your position, but you could moonlight in other parts of the country. He came to Guangzhou in a research institute that I happened to have some connection to. So when I went to Guangzhou, I would go there to visit my friend, and he would be like you, sitting in one of the desks and moonlight as a research assistant for that research organization to earn much higher income. So he was swept up in this reform process as well. because he was telling me income over at home was too low. He's a historian, he was writing local party history, very boring and stable income, no opportunity of promotion, and he was very eager to take advantage, jump to the sea. That's what is 下海. And he 下海 to come to Guangzhou. I met him, and he not volunteer, but he suggested, I will cut newspaper stories about workers for you to be my research assistant. You have to remember, before the day of Google and anything internet, so you need actually to cut, do newspaper story clips. And of course I paid him, and it turned out that my payment may be too high. His colleagues told me that because after you hired him, he did nothing but cutting news clips every day in Guangzhou. So he was helping me, and then all the stories that he was putting together for me were all about protest. And one day I said, "You are from there. Do you know these people, these workers who protested?" And he said, "Of course. All my families, relatives, neighbors, nobody has been. All of them have been, participating in these protests." So there, I found my connection, and I said, "Well, I want to study them. Can you introduce me to them?" And he said, "Of course. And you can stay in my home." Of course, I pay him and his wife again very happy, eager to host me, because for them it's extra income. So as you can see, the whole logic, my access to this field site is very indicative of what was happening to ordinary working class families. Now he's an intellectual, but nevertheless from the Rust Belt, and his relatives were all part of this phenomenon. And my entry to this world is through the market reform, because otherwise he would have never come to Guangzhou. I would have never hired him, and he would never be hosting me. Anyway, so this is how I began this. It sounds like it is a happenstance, but I think if you have research ideas in your head, it'll be easy for you to turn those ideas and connect them to the people you meet. If you don't have any idea in your head and you're not thinking about research, you may see this guy and you will not see any use, or you won't want to pursue this kind of connection further. So luck is important, definitely. But luck itself doesn't constitute research question. You have to constitute the research question, and then you begin to see opportunities when they arise. So I think you always have to be on the lookout for opportunities to do research. Anyway, so he opened the door for me. Now, then I immediately had to think about what my puzzle was. As I said to you, you don't wait for the puzzle formulation. You really have to ask it at the very beginning. Otherwise, or very soon, once you started the project, otherwise you may land on a research question that doesn't really have much import, sociologically, scholarly, in terms of scholarly knowledge. However, I didn't mention in the first day of class, there are two possible beginning points of arriving at a puzzle. You could either begin with an empirical puzzle and try to find your theory, or like in my first book, I actually began my first book with a theoretical puzzle. I was asking gender, the missing part of gender in Marxist labor theory, because I was a grad student, I was doing theory reading. My advisor was a Marxist, he actually created that theory of labor regime. So I began with theory, a theoretical puzzle, and look for few sites. In this particular project, I did the opposite, or I took the second route, which was to start with an empirical puzzle, and then try to integrate, work theories into the empirical puzzle. Either way is fine. You can start from either way, either point, but very soon you should be, or in the process of research, you should have a puzzle that is both theoretical and empirical. But the beginning point, as you are thinking, some of you are thinking about formulating a project, you can really start with an empirical puzzle. So when I started, what was the empirical thing that puzzled me, or empirical questions that I asked? I still remember this was very high on my mind. Why was I interested in labor protest? Well, because it was puzzling that in an authoritarian regime, basically a police state, that so many workers were doing protesting day and night, and the large number of protests in an authoritarian context is something that is puzzling, because what is authoritarian regime? Is coercive, it precludes people from staging resistance. That's a very fundamental character of authoritarian regime. And those protests in those days were able to sustain in terms of large numbers and the level, that is the kind of pervasiveness you can see in many parts of China, and large numbers of people participating, large number of events. So the volume itself, in such a country that is known for being tightly controlled and the use of coercive power, that was puzzling. Empirically, I didn't use any theory, but it's just, empirically I'm curious about this phenomenon. But another important empirical puzzle for me was, why didn't worker protests bring about more obvious political change? This question basically was, okay, there were many protests, but why were the protests not more powerful? The first question was, what made possible protest in this very coercive context, very tightly controlled regime? But the second question is, why are they not even more numerous and politically powerful? Do you get it's almost like two ends of the question. Why can they do so much, but why can't they do more? Now, the second question, by the way, if you look at the current literature on labor protests, nobody, or I'm going to say, I'm not sure, I'm 99% sure, but there's 1% uncertain. Very few people actually ask the second question, the limit to labor unrest, because they don't want to reveal the limit of labor unrest. As I said in the first day, many people are so sympathetic and so determined to make the case that workers are powerful in China. They didn't want to ask the second question I'm asking. Yes, there are lots of protests. Why can't they do so much? But why can't they do more? Which is to pose a political threat or destabilizing effect on the regime. So basically, I'm asking the origin and the limits of labor unrest. I don't have a theoretical puzzle yet. I haven't been talking about theory. But I started the project with these. So the advice to you is, it's fine. You can start, but you need some sort of puzzle, in this case, empirical. And then you you look for your theory that turns this empirical puzzle into a theoretical puzzle as well. Okay? Do you find these puzzling? I found them puzzling. I don't know. Do you find them puzzling? Does it make sense to you when I say these are empirical puzzle? You can challenge me. I'm here open to be challenged. The book is out. I don't care about it. You can trash it the way you want. But you can always challenge me. I'm not perfect. My book is not perfect. We can, with more challenging questions, critique. We can see, how I deviated from what I professed, what I told you to do. And actually, I deviated a little bit too from my own teaching. Okay, so now I started the research with those puzzles. I started going to the Rust Belts. I'll tell you what I did. I basically met a lot of people who have been leaders and participants in those protests. And I did a lot of interviews in the field when I spent time in the Rust Belt. But I also participated in the neighborhood activities, meetings in homes. In terms of the real protest, that is when they went to a public area to shout and to sort of gather around government building, the real protest, I was only able to observe from afar. They told me not to be part of it because that would invite too much police attention. I would jeopardize their collective action. I would observe from afar. Sometimes, a lot of times I was not able to observe. I was able to observe their sit down. You know, in those days, the method of choice, I'm not sure it's in your assigned reading, the method of choice was for retired, unemployed workers not to do a rally, not to walk around town, is to sit blocking the road. They block traffic. That's the method of choice. It happens so often that if you get on a cab, a taxi, and you want to go from A to B, the taxi driver, they knew the pattern because it was so numerous. They knew the pattern of protest. They knew what day of the month the workers would likely block which road, and they would suggest a route that would take you away and just go to your place or destination without being blocked by these people. And guess why the preferred method is to block the road rather than to walk around town or shout or go with banners? Why? They were too old for that. That's a major reason, because these retirees, they consider, it's very funny talking to them. They actually tried a lot of ways and experimented with different strategies, and then they decided that they were too old to walk around town. And blocking traffic is just to sit down, you block the road. That's it. You don't do much. It wasn't demanding physically. And also because blocking the road created problems for commerce, and therefore the police would definitely show up. They wanted to draw the attention, to trigger the intervention of government, because they always thought, until today they still think, that the government is the most powerful actor that could help them indeed pressure the enterprise to pay them whatever the enterprise owed them. They needed the government's intervention to draw the attention of the local government. There's no better way to block the traffic of the road and also stop the entire local economy. So anyway, I went there, I talked to a lot of people, I interviewed a lot of people. I saw them in their homes. I saw them pasting the handbills, which, how many of you have been to old industrial cities? Do you know how they live together? Those block buildings, those Soviet-style block buildings, they are called Danwei housing, Danwei Fang. It's everybody in the same enterprise would live together. So it's just a paradise for interviewers, because you go up and down and that's your entire enterprise there. And so it's easy to hang out, and they go to each other's home. So you go to one person's living room, sit there, talk, and then somebody would join. You can see how they drink. Some people got very alcoholic. They got depressed. Some of them would play mahjong at home, kind of gambling, and while they do that, they would tell you who became addicted to gambling. I mean, a lot of these domestic issues, wife beatings. So I got a good sense of the community, and more importantly, the housing arrangement was a big facilitator for them to coordinate the action after the enterprise went under. So although I couldn't go to all the protests or become part of the protests in most cases, I was able to see the formation of protests, because as they were talking and, or after the protest when they returned to their apartment. So that is basically the field work. And I also have many people who they couldn't stop talking once you started them, because the whole experience was so personal and emotional to them. One of you wrote about or talked to me about how to handle very emotional field work. And that was a big challenge for me doing this research, because I it's still very hard for me. Because sometimes when we talk to these workers, they would tell you their friends. A case I still remember, an unemployed couple from the same enterprise. The company went under, the same couple lost their job at the same time, and they felt so desperate that one day they went to the market, and it was retold to me by the market people who were selling meat or something. And they said, this woman who lived there forever came and bought some really good meat one day. And they were very surprised because, well, these people were unemployed. But one day, she showed up in the market, asked for the best cut of meat, and nobody paid attention, or even, spare a thought, but accepted, oh, that's very strange, maybe they celebrate something. Guess what? The woman cooked the last meal, they have 2 young kids, and she killed herself by adding some poison in the meat, and she killed the whole family. And so that was the kind of, and people were still like, it's very difficult to end not just once. And there were collective family-based suicide. I heard so many stories about people talking about their co-worker jumping off the building in front, particularly chose a spot where that was the manager's office. Outside the manager's, basically the office is like, I was the manager, the door was open, he was jumping in front of the manager and killed himself. So you can imagine, unemployment was not a process that we in the capitalist society would take as just one challenge in life. For them, these people just saw the end of many things when they lost their employment. More importantly, more directly to me, was when I sit down with some of these guys, middle-aged men would cry like a baby when they talk about, they were so, first of all, most of them get very angry when they say, well, we give the state, the government, we gave the party our whole life, our youth, and we accepted very low salaries because we expect this and that. That was the promise, but now it's gone, and they felt so betrayed. You could feel, you could see, literally, these guys are very emotional, and because they have really their heart invested in the government's project of building the country. They always thought that they have contributed tremendously, and now it had come to nothing. So I think it was one of the most emotional, it has to be, it was one of the most, not one of the, but the most emotional experience I had as an ethnographer, because you're dealing with people who use their life to experience that historical process. Yesterday I was telling some of you about this guy who threw himself on the railroad as a form of protest when his workers running down on the street, his window was open, he heard his co-workers calling, hey, come, we're going to lie on the rail to protest. And he joined, and so he was telling me the whole process, and then in his apartment, and then very soon into the interview, I was like, this guy, I find him, something is wrong with his expression, his way of talking, and he was dressed in very strange clothes anyway. But I didn't pay attention until he was talking the story, and then he was using some strange language, and his eyes were somehow, dazed, and I began to try to figure out what happened, and actually, I began to notice his clock. The clock like that has stopped. There was no electricity, and it was kind of cold in his apartment, and also noticed that there was no heat at all. In the Northeast, they turn on the heat, the government turned on the heat to everybody's home. There was no heat at all, and the reason was he failed. He didn't have money to pay for utilities, and the bill that's why the clock was stopped. And I realized that he has some mental problems. So I was talking to a kind of deranged worker, and so he was okay before, but I think the unemployment stress. I later talked to other people who knew him, and they said that he wasn't like this before the restructuring, And so you can see very many examples of human cost of this thing called industrial restructuring. So as an ethnographer, our job is really to find out how people experience these very objective historical processes that we write about all the time. But only ethnographers could, through data collection, through immersing in the world of the subjects, as we mentioned in the first day, could we be able to give another layer of description and understanding of what industrial restructuring, what transition is. If you look at the sociological literature in those years, transition is the big theme in the leading sociology journal about China. But none of them would talk about the human side of transition. So this is our unique contribution to understanding and documenting social change that could appear very abstract. Structure could be very abstract, but you give that structural transformation, that historical process, some form of human the existential reality. And that is, I think you have to grasp this and hold on to it as ethnographers. Don't be afraid of writing stories, because that's why we do ethnography, is to gather people's story and their reaction, their experience, try our best to render that experience so that it becomes social. Otherwise, it would be just a very mechanical way. You can talk about structural change all you can without shedding light on what it means to real people. And this is something, it's our job basically. If you're a comparative historical sociologist, people don't expect you to talk about that. If you lay out the numbers, that's fine. You'll talk about how many enterprises have gone down, how many private ones have come up, and that's the transition, that's the documentation of transition. But ethnographers have the job of presenting these through human experiences and the meaningful interpretation, the reaction, their agency. For instance, why do they block the road and not go for rallies? It's their agency and their understanding of the situation. So the fieldwork, that's the fieldwork in the Rust Belt. And so there was no comparison if you pay attention to so far. I was starting the project in the Rust Belt, and it was in the middle of the project. Although in the introduction I have these two comparative cases right at the beginning, but it didn't emerge until I was maybe halfway into the research that I decided that I wanted to do a comparison. So I was doing these field work while at the same time, of course, writing your field notes. Now you always have to write your field notes. And while at the same time, I was struggling with my theoretical puzzle, so it's normal. I was trying to think what kind of theories are relevant. I know what kind of theories are relevant, but what were puzzling? I didn't. So the first thing that came to my mind and turned out to be very relevant was E.P. Thompson, which I read as a grad student. How many of you are still reading E.P. Thompson? Or how many of you have read E.P. Thompson? You have? In what class? Anthropology. Anthropologists read E.P. Thompson. Who else? Which class did you read it for?
I just read it.
You're reading it. How many of you have heard of this book?
Yeah, the translation.
Not so sure, just a few. It's a classic. It's a classic that was published in 1963, but it was such a foundational text for cultural studies, for Marxist theory, for people who want to understand the working class. It was about the English working class, but basically the idea was about the importance, not so much about structural change of the economy, which was the classic orthodox Marxist position. Working class resistance came about when you have proletarianization, which was a process of getting rid of their livelihood resources and force them into wage work. So that was the Marxist position, but E.P. Thompson said, hey, that's really not adequate as an explanation, because we have to look at how people experience the objective change in the economy. And only that kind of cultural mediation, he called it cultural mediation, would make us understand what structural change would bring about, because it's mediated by people's collective experience. And so we have to pay attention to collective experience, cultural understanding, particularly a very important concept that eventually was very central to my analysis was the idea of moral economy. That is, people don't react to exploitation, even if they know they are being exploited. If they accept that it is fair for the boss to take more than the workers, which is exploitation. If you think the boss should get a larger part of the profit, and you as the worker get a lesser part, if you think it is okay, it is morally okay, then there won't be resistance because you accept it. It's like there is inequality. Nobody go to the street and protest against inequality if you see this as acceptable. So cultural and moral understanding, moral economy means that what people react to, economic reality, again, is mediated by some moral framework. And in order to understand why some people riot, if the neighbor has food and he refuses to share with a starving neighbor, that is because people have some kind of moral precepts that decides that this is wrong, and therefore they would do something about someone having food and not sharing. And moral economy changed with time, and so his idea is that we have to restore the agency of workers before we can understand how they react to proletarianization, how they react to capitalism. So for me, what this question, or what his insight inspired, is the question of the cultural logic of socialism. When E.B. Thompson was writing, he was looking at the rise of the market and how that would change people's moral precepts. But in this case, what China was going through was the death of socialism. That was the decline of a socialist moral universe, the ideology, the values that were embedded in socialism. So I have to twist it a bit to ask the moral economy question, but now applies it to socialism, and say what is the cultural logic of socialism that inspire and enable rebellion against socialism. Now, whether this is a theoretical puzzle or not is up to you to judge, but at least I leverage this notion of moral economy, use it in a socialist context, and try to figure out what socialism could do as a motivator, as a cause of labor protest. Labor protests usually happen under capitalism, in Marx's formulation, as people go through capitalism. My sort of twist to this argument is what happened if it is socialism that has been guiding people's idea, and its retreat is creating unrest. I also got, now I'm telling you all the inspirations that go into their argument. So in this sense, this book does not have, this book does not have as crisp and clearly stated theoretical puzzle as my first book. My job here, or what I have achieved here, was an integration of several strands of theories that I triangulate and integrate into some sort of new theoretical framework for understanding what happens in China. It's a very case-specific kind of theoretical argument that I propose. So the second inspiration, and you will notice, I'll tell you, you'll notice, well, I should put it in the question later, but I will come back to this. The second inspiration is from China studies, so don't underestimate Taiwan study or China studies, because it's the case about China, I really want to, I was thinking, I didn't consciously, but it was in my head, to think about protest. And if you read Elizabeth Perry's work, a very important central argument that she has made over and over again is that in China, state and society are not opposed to each other. In the Western notion is always state versus society. But in China, she has several pieces that talked about how the state actually encouraged protest at various points in Chinese history. For instance, Mao, Cultural Revolution, very clearly it was instigated from the top, responded from the bottom up. So the state is not like something that was working against society or society against the state. There were more intricate relationships and dynamics between these two. That's one example. The other example is she traced it to very traditional political ideology in China, saying that, think about the idea of mandate of heaven. Mandate of heaven means that the emperor could rule if there was no resistance, if people would subscribe and see him as having a mandate of heaven. But people are righteous to rebel if the emperor is bad. And therefore there will be popular rebellion. The emergence of popular rebellion was always taken by ordinary people as a sign of a decay of the dynasty, that the emperor has lost his mandate and therefore is justified for society, peasants to rise up against it. So she was going through many, many cases in China, Chinese history, contemporary and otherwise, and to suggest that, when we think about protests, we should also think about the state. So this will become something that I also draw on to make the argument that if we want to understand the patterns, the characters of labor protest in China today, we need to look at what the state has done, how the state shaped how people protested. So that's an inspiration. State elite shapes popular protest. And then the third strand of theory that I also engage with and sort of revise a little bit in the study is the Marxist theory of class formation. Marx and Marxists focused on factory-based solidarity and collective capacity. They thought that modern factory was particularly conducive to collective action because factories grouped people together where they share their grievances, where they know each other, where also in factories they are made to be similar in their role, in their job, in their material interest. So a lot of things came out of this factory system. For me, I use this as I explained to you. Work unit housing is that kind of environment that allow people to consolidate their collective capacity, know each other, share grievances. But I also introduce in this book the notion of social reproduction shaping, limiting people's capacity to protest and to pursue class action. This came about when I was doing fieldwork. I wasn't thinking about social reproduction out of the blue or from any books. It came to me when I followed workers in protests and going to the court. And I realized, very interestingly, for the migrant workers, so the companies, they were fighting against the companies for all sorts of reasons. And sometimes when the companies went under, they were made unemployed, but they would try to fight and meet and go to the court. And then sooner, because I was following the process of legal mobilization, what I discovered was very soon, the group of workers who were very determined to fight, because they were unemployed, they didn't have a job, or they have to change jobs because they were fired by the company, the factory. Very soon, what they did was they would go home, back to the village. So I followed them to the village. So I went to Sichuan and to some very beautiful countryside, but really remote. And Sichuan is the big province where I went with some workers, different groups of workers. And I saw what happened to them when they went back to the village. Surprisingly, in the cities, they were very willing to fight and they feel like my wage is mine, I need to get it back, it's unjust that I was paid below the legal minimum. All the reasons, the exploitation and the low wages that prompted them to pursue unrest or conflict, protest or strike. When they went home, you will see that they were not living in a very desperate situation. Some of them have their own business. They were employer, not employee, when they were back home. I still remember the bamboo. In Sichuan, there's lots of bamboo. So some of them used the bamboo plant to make all sorts of baskets. It's a small workshop that he owned. I asked him, is it your shop? And he said, yeah, these are my workers. So what happened? So what did I see then? I saw that, yes, they were totally exploited in the site of production. But when you consider the land ownership, the land right they had, and the businesses they had back home, the village economy, which is supposed to reproduce the labor power for them, the realm of social reproduction, they were not exploited. They were pretty stable and they were given resources outside the realm of production. And what did it suggest to me? It suggests to me that social reproduction, as long as they have resources for social reproduction, that would limit their willingness, their interest to fight capital. That was the limit on labor unrest. Parallel to that, for the state's own sector workers, the retirees, the pensioners, I hang out with them and I suddenly one day realized, you go to their homes, I still remember the living rooms, the work unit housing, also has been sold to them. They were home owners. Those homes were sold to them at sub-market prices, so they were property owners, and they were nicely decorated. I still remember in those days, big screen TV was like the new commodity. It's like everybody's TV was bigger than mine. It was big, and they all have hi-fi systems, big ones in those days. Very nice, old-fashioned sofas. Almost everyone has the same set of, furniture, but they were all very clean, nicely put together, and they own those property. Which means, and it suggests to me that despite the fact that they were workers very angry about the socialist transformation or transition, but they also, the social reproduction, they were not homeless. They were exploited, but they were not homeless. They actually own properties. What does that mean is, again, it's like the village business and land that migrant workers have. For socialist workers, they also have resources to social reproduction. And that's why every time they go on the street, they go home, and they are not desperate in the material sense at all. And that is why the argument I made in the book is that, yes, there were a large number of protests, but people are not, they don't have fundamental contradiction with the system of socialism, or with the current system, because they have a stake in the system. For the state socialist workers, they were property owners. For the migrant workers, their land right guaranteed a floor of subsistence, and for some smart people, they actually can run businesses. So in a sense, they were both very poorly treated working class, right? The workers who were getting low, very, very low wages, and that's why so many people come to invest. And then for the state-owned workers, they didn't get their pension. They were denied the package that they were promised. But ultimately, the system wasn't too bad to them. So there is a limit to how much they would want to go to really challenge the system. There will be no revolution because they have things to lose. Remember, for Marxists, you have nothing to lose but your chain. No, these guys have a lot to lose if they challenge the system too much. So that helps me to answer the question, one of the empirical puzzles. What's the limit to working class rebellion against socialist transition? you have to follow these guys and then try to conceptualize what is home ownership means for them. It means that they have really good, very substantial stake. And it means also social reproduction. Resources are available for them, despite the fact that when they are in production, in the site of production as workers, they have all sorts of legitimate grievances arising from the site of production. But when you expand your analytical vision to include not just production, because most people study workers like it's site of production, you go beyond and see social reproduction. And this is through field work I bring in social reproduction as a factor limiting protest. So now you can see I'm trying to draw on these existing theoretical propositions and try to use them to explain what I document in a book. What would you, if you were me, instead of using these, if you were a sociologist, what would be the most natural literature that would come to your mind that perhaps you would want to use to formulate your puzzle? What is protest? Which field in sociology would have lots of theories about people going to the streets, get organized? Anyone? What theory would you? Yes.
It has to be something be the intersection between labor and protest.
There's a field of study. Actually, it's what you were studying. I mean, this morning we just passed this proposal. This morning, what is your field?
Contentious politics.
Contentious politics, mobilization, collective mobilization. There's a field of social movement theories. Yeah, theories of collective mobilization, contentious politics. I didn't mention any of these. Why?
I think that because they are not specific enough for your case, because they are labor protests.
The labor protests.
And you specify, in this case, you specify the subject and the subjectivity of these protests.
Right. Yeah. I think you're very close to what I was expecting in terms of answer. I could have easily framed my study using the theory, the set of the literature of collective mobilization, and try to find some of the what are some of the concepts, and use those concepts to look at this case and see what is inadequate. As a matter of fact, do you know Charles Tilly? Anyone? Does it ring a bell? He's a very famous sociologist who literally created the field of collective behavior and collective mobilization. He has died. He died several years ago. But I had the fortunate opportunity that after my book was published, before he died, I had the occasion where he was in a room like this with me sitting one end of the table, he was at the other end. And people made him, that event was his critique of my book. And he liked my book, by the way. He really liked it, and he actually recommended it to many other people. But one of his questions was, why didn't you use my concepts? Which I did. I have totally avoided that literature of collective mobilization. Repertoire. Well, today we did this morning. Elon's proposal had to do with how he invented this notion of repertoire of collective mobilization, and basically I could very well fit the repertoire thing into my analysis. How different groups of workers, how they put up different kinds of protest. But I didn't use that literature because, despite the fact that it would be the most obvious, because I have by that point, and I can tell you, by that point, I remember I was no longer the PhD student I was. As a PhD student, you were sort of uncertain of your own grasp of things, and you would want to have some really clear-cut theory, established theory to engage with, so that you can come out the other ends with some theoretically significant findings, and it's all very nicely packed together. When I was writing my second book, I got older, my mind got, I would like to think is better, thinking and more sophisticated and more willing to be on my own. And what I have found looking at and thinking about the collective mobilization literature, I began to realize that despite its prominence and its importance, its centrality, and if you do any kind of social movement, you almost like 100% of people would just go into that literature and use that literature. And I was really upset because the more I read that literature, the more I realize that literature is so useless. And really, there's no theory. There's no specificity. It doesn't tell you much. It just gives you repertoire of what? Of collective action, structure of political opportunity structure, framing. But there's no theory. If you pay attention, there's no theory of explaining what kind of framing will emerge under what conditions. What kind of repertoire will happen under what conditions? There's no identity politics. I mean, they have all these fancy names, but no hypothesis to link them together or to propose anything explanatory. I told Tilly when he asked me, why didn't you use repertoire? This is what repertoire of collective action means. And I said, I didn't see any theory you had. I couldn't find it useful. And he just laughed. He's a real scholar. He has no fear for young, who was relatively young at that. Compared to him, I was a spring chicken. Compared to him, and I could say anything, and he was just laughing. But he still liked the book. For me, why I mentioned this, I was going to tell you, I wanted to have some more specificity to the theories that I invoke for this study, instead of resorting to something that is very general, that sociology, in a lot of cases, want to propose that are universal covering law. That is what the goal of sociological theorizing is about. Collective behavior theories do not distinguish between political economies, historical periods, types of protest. It's all every kind of movement. You could use the same set of rhetoric or concepts. And to me, that is not very useful, because I'm talking, as I said here, is about China. There's maybe some kind of political culture that have extended from the past to the present between the state and society and the dynamic there. I can't go to social movement literature to find that China-specific kind of proposition. And it's about worker. So I have to look at Marx, because Marx has written most about worker, not environmental movements, sexuality movement, all these ethnic-based movement. So in terms of choosing theory, my advice is you don't necessarily have to go to the most general and the most often cited literature. Make your own judgment if you can. No, I'm telling you now, you graduate students, I wasn't able to do the same when I was a grad student. But as I grow as a scholar, what I realized was I became increasingly more independent-minded, and also because at that time I didn't have to worry about tenure. I don't really need to worry about how people judge me. I just write what I believe is a better book. I want to write about theories that I'm more satisfied with, regardless of whether my peer would judge me positively or negatively. And I think this set of theories that I engage with in the book are more relevant to the cases, like Elon was saying, that they are more targeted at the kind of subject matter that I was dealing with, which was about working class formation. So, too bad there wasn't, or there isn't in the book, a very crisp hole in the literature that I could claim to say, hey, my study filled that hole. Like in my first study, gender, I'm filling that hole of gender in Marxist theory. Is more clumsy, is less clear-cut, but this book actually has won me more recognition, and people from very, very far afield from this, they read the book. Something really clicked. And if you ask me what really clicked for many readers who are not necessarily studying worker politics or China, I think it is it's the detail of the book, the empirical stories. They were really, really moving. And I was just the tool for the workers to express themselves. When I finished the book, I was really moved by how the workers articulated their experience. And they were, remember, especially in the Rust Belt, these workers have been indoctrinated, well, we call it indoctrinated, the indoctrination with party ideology, but actually they were fed many Marxist concepts. They have the concepts to express and observe what was happening to them. So, very old workers, but they would say, no, this is exploitation. Migrant workers who were not allowed proper time to take their lunch, they were not treated like human beings, that was condemned because they were told what was the superiority of socialism, why was capitalism inhumane. So they were given a lot of these concepts to frame what they were going through. And so if you had time, just go through that, particularly the chapter on Rust Belt. People always love that chapter because the workers were talking about what it was like for the transition happening to them, and why they were so upset and had to go to the street. Anyway, so the book was well received. I think less so for these series, although I think today I still would not revise my argument about the fact that they were exploited as workers, but they were, beneficiaries of the socialist system in different ways as the limit factor to why the working class movement took the form of numerous protests, but never radicalized to the extent that these workers would want to overthrow the system. That was one of the major reasons. Another very important reason, another finding, was the cellular nature, that these protests happened in one place and then the police would come to stop it from spreading, and therefore the notion of cellular activism. So you have many, many singular cases, but they never were able to horizontally, laterally organize into a larger scale. Number is not scale. Number is just number. You can have many, many singular cases without them coordinating to become a collective force that they could mobilize at the same time and transform the numerous protests into a national or even provincial working class movement. That's another reason why we have many, many protests without regime instability. So I think these are still, 10 years, more than 10 years after the book, I still think that, we are still dealing with this situation. Now, one of you in today's response papers, one of you said, hey, well, I was wrong, because you can see today, have people heard of the recent case, or in recent years there have been more protests where students in China, university students, were participating in labor protest, and JSIC, is it JSIC?
JSIC, yes.
Is the case where it most recently happened, where many students were arrested, and so they were coming from different parts of the country. So one of you said, hey, I got it wrong, because actually students, these were not cellular protests. I said Chinese in my book. He thinks I said China will only see cellular protests, but now we see protests that apparently have national participation. People from different parts of the country participate. How would I respond to that? Would I say that I was wrong, the argument that I proposed, because reality has changed? How would that affect my assessment of my own book? if the reality has changed. I was writing about protests like 15 years ago, right, in the 2000s and the first part of 2000, the first part of the first decade of 2000, yes. I was writing about the transition period. Now the transition is over, and you see new patterns. Let's say, I'm not sure there is a new pattern, but let's say there's a new pattern of labor protest. Should people not read my book anymore? That this is wrong? How would you, because you have to deal with this kind of question. That is, the question is what? That you finish a study, okay, you study a certain period of society. You make an argument, theoretical and whatnot. And then, 10 years later, the phenomenon has changed. How would you defend your book? If the phenomenon, if society has changed in a way that is different from what you documented, does it mean your book is no use? Your thesis is no use? Anyone? That means you think it's no use, no? Yes.
我认为是，如果就是惊喜，
大声一点，因为他们听不见。
惊喜不一样嘛。那如果现在情况改变了，那是不是可以找出那是什么东西导致现在不一样？那这样子就是一个跨越时空的 case 的比较，这样。
So the answer here is maybe the conditions have changed, right? The conditions for labor protest have changed, and therefore we should look at the changing conditions. Can you explain yourself better? I'm sure I'm not.
可以说是 condition， 或者是说一些，就是广义上来说是 condition 嘛，就是譬如说是哪一些原因，也有可能是事件，有可能是什么东西的发明，或是外在环境的改变。
Can I follow this?
Yes. Yes, you and then.
So I'm
Speak.
so like in terms of extended case method, the generality
Okay.
is not like to extend across history. So like it's to focus the particular situation during the transition from socialism to capitalism that you were studying.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So the job or the task of the study is not to explain the current situation, but still that foundation is important for us to have some tools or like.
Okay, great. You want to add something? Or say something different?
我认为就是可以，实际上还是可以比较的部分，就是在这里还是提供了很多理论或者构建上面的很多 part， 比如说国家可能还是采用 legal authoritarianism 这样子的治理的方式等等，但我们还是可以比较说不同的这些条件有什么样的改变，或者是说可能当时的抗争者主要还是不管是农工或者是东北这些退休的国企的人员，那他们在现在的跟现在的抗争者比较，在人员的组成条件上也有很大的不一样。那在一个新的条件之类的情况之下，还是可以跟旧的这个2000年初期的条件不同的部分进行比较。然后可能主要改变的部分是，例如说现在的部分可能是新的这些工人的社会的条件，他们可能已经是农工的第2代、第3代，或者是他们的学历条件之类比较高，然后相对的可能是社会的那个产业的趋势已经有点不一样，因为比如说往电子业啊，或是需求的人比较少之类的方向发展，但相对来说，可能最上层的法律的维权体制，实际上并没有很明显的改变，所以整体而言，好像这个 model 还是有很多延续下来，然后可以作为预测的部分。
Yes.
Yeah, following this, I think a very simple defense can be, so following extended case method, you're welcome to reconstruct by theory. And also, I think society can change But the ethnographical reality is eternal.
What is eternal?
The ethnographical reality that you documented.
Okay,
That
it
piece.
happened in those
that
days.
piece
Yes. Well, yes.
I would like to add that to defend, because if people are trying to attack that, saying that, okay, now the students are mobilized and they're more integrated, I think the way to defend is that your book has the value of providing the limits of why they are not willing to push more. And this spirit in your book about finding the limit of the factor that they still have something to lose back home, it can be applied into the same concept when there are students mobilizing from everywhere, but they will still go home because they still have something to lose. And maybe it's a different limiting factor, but I mean that's how you can defend your book. That I pioneered this social reproduction thing. I had this concept first in my book 10 years ago. So even though now the situation is different, you can still find new limiting factors, but I found it first, so my book is better. That's how I would defend.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think for me, I mean, many of what you said are very valid, but I think ultimately, the reason why I'm raising this question is for you to suggest to you that when you read a book, don't so easily dismiss the value of the book just because the empirical reality or the empirical phenomenon has changed. What is important? Because one book can only write about one particular period, no matter how long, maybe 100 years is the subject of your book, but still it's only 100 years. There'll be another 100 years after or before that period, so we can't cover everything. So there always is an empirical limit to any book. And reality changed, that's very common. What you want to get away and try to evaluate and really learn from the book is of course the eternal empirical documentation. That really happened, that period, what I write. The current situation has changed, that's another issue. But during that period, the empirical material in the book are still valid about that period. But what is also for sociologists and social scientists, I think is also important, that despite changing or different empirical reality, another very important contribution of social science knowledge is really about the mechanisms, is really about the causes. What are the causes of the surface phenomenon? The surface phenomenon may change because there'll be new conditions coming in, but if the underlying logic, underlying causal relations may not change, the changing reality may not negate the causal mechanism. These two are separate. You need to separate them. Otherwise, you don't need to read any book because all books are about the past and the current reality may not be the same as the past and there's no use. Well, that's not really how we should understand knowledge accumulation. The analysis may stand even the reality has changed. So now it doesn't mean there's no problem. Maybe I did miss something, and maybe I missed some factors that are causing the new phenomenon. But that's why we need to add and reformulate or enrich existing study. You look at what people have done, what people have already pointed to, and if you think it is unsatisfactory because something new has happened, I don't know what new thing has happened that trigger the supposedly new type of worker protest. But let's say there is a new type, like student plus cross-class, we call it cross-class labor protest. Let's say there's a new phenomenon, there's a new trend. And I didn't cover it in my book because there was no student, no cross-class unrest at that moment. But if you want to study this phenomenon, let's say, I don't know, one or two of you are very, assume you seem to be very interested in labor issue. So what would you do then? Well, you could use my book as a critical starting point. Critical means that you are criticizing me for missing something. And to say, hey, at that time there was no cross-class worker movement when I was writing, and therefore my propositions are 1, 2, and 3 about the cause, the factors, and the limits of labor unrest. Now you have a new type of labor unrest, and then you can use mine and to measure against the current situation and say I missed or I didn't consider some new conditions that lead to this new type. So you can build on mine or even revise some of my proposition. That's how you build on other people's work. And not to say that because there's a new type of worker protest that I didn't cover, and therefore there's no value to my analysis. So try to separate out the analysis may still stand even if the reality has changed. But by the way, I mean, I'm not going to into the detail. I don't think there's a new type. I think exactly the police strong reaction against cross-class labor protest exactly confirm my point that cellular activism is still allowed. But once you have cross-class, they come cracking down, and that's why you see all these protests. And there's only one case so far that, recent case where you see, people being arrested. So, but so far, this is one singular case. One singular case is not a national pattern. So I would still, we can argue if you're interested, but I don't think we should be spending our time there. I will say one more thing before we go for a break. And that is about cases and casing. Now, it seems very obvious that I have 2 cases, right? I have 2 field sites, and in the book I just put the terms Rust Belt and Sun Belt. A lot of people forget about the title, but they remember the Rust Belt, Sun Belt. They find it very memorable. But that didn't come. I swear to you, that didn't come until I finished writing the whole book. Now I have. It doesn't mean I don't have these. I didn't have these 2. I have these 2 cases, but I didn't really give it a more punchy kind of very snap term. Rust Belt, Sun Belt, where people remember it's 2 belts and 2 different regions, and almost like the same term, but it's very different. So I have 2 cases, 2 regional economies. And then there are many 2s I'm going to show. So 2 regions, 2 specific provinces. In terms of empirical geographical field size, I have 2 provinces. And they represent what? They represent 2 regional economic structures. One dominated by SOEs. Guangdong is dominated by private and foreign firms. So that seems very clear. And then I have 2 labor regulatory systems in the chapter that I assigned. You see that a very major factor shaping their discourse, shaping their claims, is the kind of regulation the government has used to regulate these 2 groups of workers. For the socialist worker, the law wasn't really helpful. Well, it was not the major regulatory means. It was the socialist social contract. It was basically an implicit agreement saying to the working class, be compliant, politically don't challenge the regime, but in return, what is the contract? In return, we'll give you cradle-to-grave welfare, we'll take care of your pension and medical, but be a very obedient part of the system. And then for the migrant workers, they have to sign contract, and if they want to fight the boss, fine, go to the court because you have legal labor contract. Very different systems of contract, and that are reflected in the claims that they make, shape their behavior. So it's 2 cases of labor regulation. And then also, I pay a lot of attention to workers' own history, how they collectively experience the state and the economy. So we have 2 generations of workers, state workers and migrant workers. Now, the question is, when I say Guangdong, well, Guangdong, yes, by and large dominated by private foreign firms where you find many migrant workers. But what about the state-owned enterprise and the older workers working for those state-owned enterprises? In Guangzhou, there are lots of heavy machinery factories, right? Who were regulated by, in those days, by the socialist social contract rather than a legal contract. So that means, I think this is what Pei Zhao was asking me, perhaps. I didn't answer her question well. That was within the case. I saw this internal difference. Was it what you meant? Yeah, something like, I got asked this question too. So how could I, what were my cases? They were not so clear cut, right? Because in Guangzhou, Guangdong, you have the older generation, you have another political economy, another regulatory system. So what exactly were my two cases? How do I, they were not nicely lined up.
The way I'm guessing that the way that those Guangdong SOEs were being transformed a different way from those in Liaoning. So that is.
So my Liaoning case cannot apply to Guangdong then.
Yeah. So it's in terms of these two different types. That one would be like a middle or more similar to, I don't know. That's all I want to say.
Yes, one way.
I think it's more about you're doing the theoretical sampling. You want to see why this so, the configuration of these two groups are so different, and the historical, how they develop their identity is so different, the process. But they come up a similar feature about the cellular activism you mentioned in the book. You want to explain why these seem so different, against, I think, the counterintuition of this so different group, but they use the same way or same method to organize their activity. You want to explain that? Is that?
Yeah, but you're talking about then the commonality between these two cases. The question that we're dealing on the table now is, it doesn't seem my two cases are so clean, because in Liaoning there are private industries and migrant workers. So is geography the foundation of my two cases? What constitute my two cases? That's what I want to ask you. It's not geography, right? Because if geography, the province, are the basis of the case, two provinces, two cases, then obviously there were some inconvenient differences in each of them. So my case is not really based on real geographical political economy.
It has to go back to your empirical puzzle about the transition from socialism to capitalism.
Okay, I'm giving you my take on this. Then you can decide if it is defensible. The Rust Belt and Sun Belt, it looks like these are terms referring to some real places. But in my book, in my analysis, these are not real geographical places. You can have a Rust Belt in the middle of a Sun Belt. What really constitutes the Rust Belt is a constellation. That's why I'm putting it under cases. Is a case where is a constellation of elements that make up the Rust Belt, a constellation of elements making the Sun Belt. One of the elements in the Rust Belt is the dominance of SOEs, that's the socialist planned economy, and the regulatory system, and the working class that collectively have have a collective history of the planned economy and the reaction in the transition. Those elements is the case of Rust Belt. So Rust Belt is actually not a geographical concept, and it is not purely a political economic structure. It's not purely defined by the socialist contract or the legal contract, the regulatory system. And it's not purely defined by the generation of workers. A Rust Belt case includes all the above as they relate to each other. So in a sense, it's an ideal type. Does that make sense? It's an ideal type where you have all these elements related to each other and forming a dynamic that produce a particular type of working class action. So empirically, even though Liaoning has migrant workers and private enterprises, they are not part of the Rust Belt. Physically, yes, you go to your province, you see them, you find them. But analytically, they are outside my conception of the Rust Belt. And so, casing means you constitute a conceptual case that may not be totally mapped onto a physical space or particular group, but is an amalgamation of these things as a chemical reaction, as a constellation of elements, and they constitute a case. And so the Rust Belt is political economy, is a state regulation, it is a system of state regulation, and people sharing generational experience. And that is the Rust Belt. Peter?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to define your cases as such. But we still face a problem such as gender division among the SOE workers and migrant workers. And how do you deal with this?
Right. You can introduce any elements similar to gender. You can say, what about what other? Okay, gender. Let's say gender. It is an empirical question, actually. Gender didn't focus. I didn't focus on gender because my interest here is to observe how people protest. And I didn't see a gender divide or that women and men protest differently. So then in my analytical story, I didn't introduce gender into the analysis because women were doing the same thing as men. And so I didn't pay attention. I mean, I pay attention, but there was no difference. And therefore, it's not a theoretical question for me. It is not a theoretical dimension that I want to use or introduce in order to make sense of how workers protest. But I do see very clear difference in terms of their repertoire of action or their strategies and identities under these two cases. So gender may be empirically existing, but it's not differentiating. You could then come back and say, well, gender doesn't always mean gender difference, right? You can talk about the social construction of gender rather than thinking of men as different from women. That's the way of using gender too. But that would be a totally different project where you'll be looking at how the experience of transition can be gendered. That is, maybe men and women understood the process, or it will have different gender meaning or different strategies, or so on and so forth. But that's not my theoretical question. My theoretical question is really how they protest, and if gender doesn't help me to explain how they protest, I drop it off outside the picture. Yes.
I have a question toward the previous question.
Can you speak up, please?
I mean, are you suggesting that the element of geography, if any, does not have any significance to this ideal type or this framework? Because I'm wondering, I guess, I don't know, whether if the workers serving in the SOE in Guangdong, they face the bankruptcy of SOE and they lose a job. But they have more opportunity to get a job in the private enterprise. And then, because the higher social mobility mitigates the labor unrest, the possibility of labor unrest. So it is one of the...
Very good, very good. So you're pointing out that I missed another very important element. But it's not geography, it's economic opportunity, which is different from geography. Right?
But because it's the Sun Belt, and if Sun Belt
if the Sun Belt refers to Guangdong, which is the special region under the policy of CCP, and people living exactly in this place or in this region, he or she have more connection or the job information to the job market.
Yeah, so you're talking about job market, alternative opportunities rather than a geography. It's not a geographical concept. What you're talking about is alternative opportunities or alternative market, you know. So it could happen, it doesn't have to be tied to Sunbelt as a place. The term conveys a geographical location, but in my use of the term is all these things, not geography. So it could be, it doesn't have to be Liaoning and Guangdong. It could be some other places, smaller scale. It could be a city and not a province. Because the defining features are more to do with institutions and how institutions and the economic structure and the kind of workers that got caught up in the whole process. So the cases. So that's what I want to be clear about is the notion of Rust Belt and Sun Belt. That's why casing is a conceptual process. And what are these two cases? Theoretical cases. What do they represent? And in the literature, because of E.P. Thompson, there is this idea of the making of the working class. Working class has to be made, that they make themselves, they act on the objective condition and become class in itself. So there's the making of the class, but what we are also seeing in the Rust Belt is the unmaking of the working class. So that's why this book conceptually is about unmaking of the working class in the Rust Belt and the making of the working class in the Sun Belt. Okay? 好，其实有一些我已经就跟你都已经说过。我的 field work 就是一个 discovery 的过程啊，中间在一边做一边发现有什么新的因素，这些都已经讲过，就不用再。Field work as communicative action. This I think is important. You may in the course of field work, we usually will encounter some resistance. People don't want to talk to us. And that's very normal. And so that's why when you design a study, at the point when you design and try to figure out how much time I need, if you think you need to talk to about 50 people, let's say, it's always advisable to try to find 100 people. So you basically have to allow for the double number of people to approach in order to get the desirable size of the sample. I want to say that many people would not want to talk to us because they don't want to be studied. I don't know how you feel about being studied. Do you like being studied? So we need to put ourselves in the shoes of our subjects and be really patient. I mean, this is a normal human reaction. We don't want people to know us because knowledge is power. And but I also want to highlight something that I have repeatedly found in the course of my fieldwork. And it is that fieldwork is really what Habermas would say, a kind of communicative action. people want to communicate. People want to communicate without regard to power. And you could say, too idealistic. There'll be no context of communication where power is absent. Even when I go to the field, I talk to miners, I talk to officials, there's always some level of power relationship. So we can't realize the real ideal type of communicative action where everybody's equal, you talk because of rational discussion, you want to reason. But I also have repeatedly relied on people's desire to express themselves and to communicate with somebody, to make them understand, make me understand what they are going through, or what they have experienced. So don't give up when somebody say, hey, you get kicked out from some places, and you think this is the end of the research. No. One person will kick you out, another would welcome you. This is always the case. And I've also talked about some of the emotional encounters. People's, they know. One of the power that we really wield, and is important to a lot of people who don't have that kind of power, is our power to produce knowledge. To write a book is something that is very important. You put something in words and in a book form that could have a life of its own. That in itself is what motivates some of, at least my subjects, to be able to want to talk to me, because they want their story to be written up and they can't write the stories themselves. And but then we also need to be aware that there are limits to how much they can contribute to this kind of communicative action. Time is one thing, because especially if we study poor people don't think poor people have lots of time. No, they have to actually spend every moment or a lot of their waking hours trying to resolve a lot of the existential material issues. Politics is another. People care about, we worry about what we use the data for, and spying, the suspicion of researchers being a spy. Economics, now, nitty-gritty thing, as far as possible, I would want, and I have given people money. I would promise people if they're willing to talk to me, to compensate for their time and sometimes transportation, I would give them beer money, so to speak, beer money. I drink by now, so you can say beer money, but people drink. My miners, they love drinking, so beer money for their time to talk to me. If you can manage, that is, if you can find research funding to cover interviewee compensation, that's very legitimate. And because I've been to very poor places, the unemployed workers and also Africa, they appreciate, they need, you can see, they can make good use of what to us is very little, but for them is a meaningful additional something. Power of the state is pervasive, but what I've learned in this research is, I've told you that I've been arrested, they took me, I wouldn't use the word arrest, but they took me from an alley where I was waiting. I was told there would be a protest, so I was just sitting in a taxi and watching. It was very narrow, no traffic, but it was directly looking at the entrance of the government building where the protest was supposed to happen. And while I was waiting, plainclothes police descended on me and took me and my driver back to the bureau and separated us and began sort of interrogating me. And so the power of the state was very pervasive. They could put a stop to my research. But what I also realized, and this is more interesting, that even in an authoritarian country, at a moment when the police was very sensitive to protest and didn't want the news of protest to spread, I found that there are numerous spaces in the Rust Belt or the Sun Belt for researchers to get into and be able to study. There'll be spaces that in a totalitarian system for researchers. For instance, I stay in the Rust Belt with my friend in his home, and in the housing units, basically it was you can go around the building and people didn't, they can mobilize collective action because you can knock on your doors of your neighbor, so you can stick to the neighborhood and be able to do a lot of research. And also, the reason why they were taking me away was not because I was observing any regular protest. They were very sensitive because I later found out, because they interrogated me and I could tell what they were trying to find out, and what they were worried about was not because there was going to be a protest happening. It was because they realized they got tips from somewhere else that this protest and this particular place in particular have cross-class mobilization, cross-region mobilization, that is, and cross-factory mobilization. It was not a cellular protest that I wrote about as the dominant type. Yes, most protests was cellular, but they were so sensitive because they thought this one would develop into cross-factory mobilization, and therefore they were on high alert, they were plain clothes, and they were trying to find out in the city who was organizing, doing what. So what it suggests to me was the fact that there were so many protests, they were allowed to happen, it was because the regime didn't stop all protests. They only stopped some protests. And what type? As soon as you have cross-factory, laterally organized, then they come cracking down. So through my own experience, I can tell what were the limits imposed by the state, and thus explain why there were so many protests. As long as protests did not cross units, whether it's class, factory, or location, region, that's fine. As long as the protest did not make political demand, as long as you're talking about wages, pension, medical, economic issues, that's fine. They let you protest, they let you send signal to the state, to the central government, which local guys are not doing the job. And so what I was trying to tell you, suggesting here, is that there are spaces, even in what looks like a very controlled system, you can still find room for research because our subjects still find room to resist. So you can sort of look at these as comparable, that if people could still resist despite heavy police control, that means the system isn't as totalitarian or as tightly controlled as you assume. There's some space. That is, if your protest is not touching on any political issue, you're not saying down with the Communist Party, down with this and that, and you're focusing on the economic issue, legal issue that your rights are written, guaranteed by law, you're fine. And not cross-organizing, you're fine. So, power of the state, I learned through the field work, where are the limits, what are the red lines, the boundaries set by the state. Now, this is something that some of you would hate to see because it's too clear. I try to analyze the 3 levels of analysis. I'm not going to the substantive content of it because you probably, if you've done the reading, I'm trying to explain the patterns, the rhetoric of these protests by looking at tracing, from the national level to the regional level and then to the subject level, the micro level. Now, this is the final part that really is the title of today's section, Encompassing Comparison. Now, I have 2 cases, right, in this book, the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, and I've explained to you the elements that constitute these 2 cases. Encompassing that's one meaning of encompassing comparison, that the elements in the case are indivisible and form one theoretical case. Each case encompasses various levels of analysis, not variables, but levels of analysis in one case. What makes it encompassing also is the fact that these 2 cases are related to each other, unlike in the first book where I treated my 2 cases as independent. What is the relation then between these 2 cases? these two cases relate to each other in the sense that Rust Belt workers are being replaced by Sun Belt workers. So you can see that, the Rust Belt workers, the working class in the Rust Belt is exiting. They are disappearing, if you will. Whereas the economy is growing, the Sun Belt working class. So they are related in the sense that one is declining, the other is rising. And they are related to each other also in the sense that they belong to the same broadly defined working class, but they pursue different kinds of protest. And they don't connect with each other. What you have if you put them together is these two classes objectively, they should belong to the same, but then subjectively and in action, they are not. So as a whole, at the national level, you are seeing a fragmented working class. Right? One, the Rust Belt, Sun Belt, they go separate way. They are fragmented, they're divided. At the national level, that means when you put them together, because through comparison you see the differences, you bring them together, the national system is the same. What it means is the working class in China is fundamentally divided, fragmented, and they don't form one working class movement. The relational dynamic is such that together they tell a story about the totality. If you put them together, they tell you a story of the total. The totality in this case is the national case to which they belong, and that totality is the absence of a national working class movement. Does that make sense to you, that these two are related in the sense that one is displacing the other as the core member or core constitution of the working class. The working class in the Rust Belt is leaving the scene because they're being made unemployed, they're older, they're not part of the production system anymore. And then the growing part is the Sun Belt part, is the Sun Belt working class. So they are related in the sense that one is displacing the other. That's one sense in which they are related. The other sense is they together suggest that there is no national working labor movement in China. It tells you the two put together, relating together. In this case, they're unrelated. They subjectively do not relate to it. They don't see each other as belonging to the same group. They don't collaborate. So together, these two patterns coexisting together means that there is no national movement. So in that sense, it tells you these cases, they are related, they're not totally separate because they actually belong to the same totality. So that, the comparison is such that when you put them together, the comparison illustrates something about the bigger whole to which the two cases belong. This is the sense of thinking of comparison as encompassing. That is, you can see that there is a totality that subsumes the cases that you are comparing. Whereas in the first project I didn't make that connection. I didn't see the relational dynamic, therefore I didn't actually tell. Through the comparison, I didn't tell a more encompassing level of analysis that goes beyond and subsume the two cases together. I didn't tell the totality of that subsumes the two cases. So in that sense, this is a comparison, but through the comparison you see, it is through the comparison that you see the bigger part to which they belong. Does that make some sense?
So the way that you suggest that in that class about to revise the
Yes,
question,
it will be like
it will
this.
be like this.
I like to raise this because in most cases when you see comparison, they don't do the encompassing comparison. They don't design the comparison as encompassing. They tend to see each case as independent of each other. But there are reasons, there are occasions when you don't treat these two cases as totally independent and theorize each case as a different variety of that phenomenon. I just raised this as an example of another kind of comparison. You don't have to say, you can decide whether it's productive, whether it tells more by thinking of the cases as connecting to each other, as having some kind of relational dynamic, or you can choose to do it as two separate cases. But in this case, I think it adds another layer of analysis if you relate these two cases together. Because that actually tells more. Instead of just say, oh, well, there are two patterns of working class mobilization, which will be the conclusion if I just say, these are two separate cases. But yes, there are two patterns. But if you put them together and think, oh, well, this group doesn't look at the other group as the same group, and they don't connect, they don't cooperate. The relation here is they look at each other as different workers. And therefore, when that happens, what does it say about the national picture? So it's an addition. It generates more knowledge about the China situation when you see these as related to each other. These cases are not separate. Putting them together gives you more understanding of the China situation.